welcome everybody and good morning. We are here. This is a video series called This is Consciousness. It's a 4-part series and this is talk number 1, part 1, called States of Consciousness. So welcome to everybody who's on the call, and we have other people who are joining us from the Facebook group. This is Consciousness Facebook group, so welcome everybody joining from there as well. So on our call today, we are going to be having a discussion about states of consciousness. I'll be defining what they are and giving some pointers to how to find them in our own experience. We'll talk a little bit about why we care about them, why they matter. So that's the first half. And the second half, we will do a guided meditation to step into the experience of some of these states together. So along the way, if you have any questions for me, please just type them into the chat and I will pick them up as we go. All of your questions and clarifications and shares are totally welcome here, and they add to the group. Just by way of a little bit of an introduction, I think most of you know me, but my name is Matt Sturm. I run a mystery school called Living Cosmos, and this series, I just go deep. I love these topics. I'm passionate about them, and so it's an opportunity for me to get to share them back out. So without any further ado, let's jump right in. We'll start with a quote from Aldous Huxley. "The ordinary waking consciousness is a very useful and, on most occasions, an indispensable state of mind. But it is by no means the only form of consciousness, nor in all circumstances the best. Insofar as they transcend their ordinary self and their ordinary mode of awareness, the mystic is able to enlarge their vision, to look more deeply into the unfathomable miracle of existence." And that is the motivation that's guiding us in here today, is to look more deeply into the unfathomable miracle of existence. Definitions. So a state of consciousness is the content of my experience of reality. Moment to moment, what my awareness is able to touch and reach, that is how I define the state of consciousness that I'm in. States of consciousness can change from moment to moment. They're transitory. So for example here, right now, all of us, we are in waking consciousness. Tonight we will go to sleep and we will enter a different state of consciousness. We'll start dreaming and we'll have dreams, and then we'll go into deep dreamless sleep, yet another state of consciousness. And at some point we'll wake up and we'll come back into waking consciousness. So we move through these different states. And in any given moment, I'm occupying one specific state. My state of consciousness is subjective, it's internal, and it's experiential. It's not objectively measurable. So you can't put a video camera inside of my state of consciousness, you can't put a ruler in and measure what I'm experiencing. It's qualitative, it's subjective. So our 5 states of consciousness that we'll be looking at today are the gross state, also known as waking consciousness, the subtle state, which is where dreaming happens, the causal state, which is where we go for deep dreamless sleep, and the pure witnessing state, which is also known as emptiness, and then finally non-duality. So the names of these 5 states I'm pulling from a philosopher named Ken Wilber. He's done an incredible amount of work and depth and study to pull through consciousness studies as we kind of know it today. Here's a quote from him talking about these labels. "Every major meditation tradition recognizes these 4 or 5 major states of consciousness. and likewise has maps of the 4 or 5 major meditative stages for moving through them, transcending and including them as they go. Significant research has demonstrated that although the surface features of each of these traditions and their state stages differ considerably from culture to culture, the deep features are in many ways significantly similar. In fact, virtually all of them follow variations on the 4 or 5 major natural states of consciousness. This is given cross-culturally and universally to all human beings. That last sentence is the really important one for me, where these states of consciousness, they transcend any specific spiritual tradition or religion or culture or historical period. From what we can tell, they are universal. It is a feature of being human, or even more broadly, a feature of the cosmos itself, this existence that we live in. On this next slide, I am not going to go into the technical definitions of each of these spiritual traditions, but I'm putting up a table here that looks at how yoga, Buddhism, and Christian mysticism have defined these different states of consciousness. So we have the gross, subtle, causal, witness, and non-dual, and then the definitions that are given across these traditions. And the reason that I put this up here is just so that you can start to take in the sense that this is maybe a universal map that we're starting to access. So with that overview, now let's go through each of these 5 states one after the other, and we'll look at what they are. Starting at the bottom, starting at the densest, the gross state of consciousness is also known as waking consciousness. In this state tends to be dominated by the ego, which you could also call our conceptual mind or the organizing self. The self-reflexive awareness, awareness that is aware of itself, that then filters all of the inputs to make sense of it and prioritize what we should be doing or where we should be going. The ego exists in a 3-dimensional world of form and matter. It's a physical reality. And we exist in linear time with a past, present, and future, and time is progressing. All of the sensory perceptions are included in the gross state, so sight, sound, taste, touch, and smell. In the Kashmiri Shaivik or Tantric traditions, these are known as the tattvas. In addition to our sense perceptions, we have internal bodily sensations. So interoception is a technical term. It means feeling myself from the inside. Proprioception, another term, means locating myself in space from the inside. And all of these kind of fall under different types of somatic awareness. I'm aware of tension, of my nervous system state, things like that. So this is all part of the gross state of physical reality. Now, we say there's one gross state, but really it exists on a spectrum, and there's not like a hard delineation. So there is a low end, more contracted type of consciousness in the gross state, and then more expansive types of consciousness, the high end of the gross state. So on the low side, we have obsession, distraction, or even dissociation, like a trauma response. At the high end, in contrast, we have flow, focus, and embodiment. And this isn't exhaustive, this is just to illustrate. So on one side we have obsession, and on the high side we have flow. At the low end we have distraction, and at the high end we have focus. And at the low end we have dissociation, and at the high end we have embodiment. And you can kind of get a sense for the range that we're mapping out of the space of this state. Flow in particular is a pretty interesting aspect of consciousness. It was defined by this Czech psychologist. His name is Csikszentmihalyi. I think I pronounced that right. Do my best. So here he is describing flow. The mystique of rock climbing is climbing. You get to the top of a rock, glad it's over, but really wish it would go on forever. The justification of climbing is climbing, like the justification of poetry is writing. You don't conquer anything except things in yourself. The act of writing justifies poetry, and climbing is the same, recognizing that you are a flow. The purpose of the flow is to keep on flowing, not looking for a peak or a utopia, but to stay in the flow. It is not a moving up, but a continuous flowing. You may move up to keep the flow going. There is no possible reason for climbing except the climbing itself. It is a self-communication. So flow is at the high end of the gross state of consciousness, and in a flow we may even move beyond the conceptual mind or the ego into an immersive state of flowing. So this is the gross state of consciousness, the one that's probably most familiar to all of us. The next degree up is the subtle state of consciousness, and I'm going to divide it into the low subtle and the high subtle, and then we'll look at the full realm together. So the low subtle state of consciousness, this is the aliveness of biological organisms. You could call it the life force, the élan vital, or the chi. It's that sense of energy, that something that makes us alive. In addition, it is the energy that's carried with the breath, the prana. So when we breathe, we're breathing physical air in, like molecules and atoms, and that's the gross level. But as we breathe in, we also infuse our bodies with life, with prana. Similarly, the energy channels and centers of the body are included in the low subtle state. So these are the meridians, the nadis, and the chakras. The passion of emotions, the qualitative felt sense of the strength, the fire, the depth of our emotions exists in this realm. So grief, anger, fear, joy, etc. There is a physical, chemical, biological, or physiological component to our emotions, but the qualitative sense, the passion of them exists in this low subtle state. Similarly, sexual energy is part of subtle energy, part of the low subtle state. So feelings of eroticism, that draw of desire, the peak of orgasm or kundalini flowing, all of these are part of our experiences of subtle energy, which exists in the subtle state. The high end of the spectrum of this bucket is the high subtle state, is our mental activity and thought forms. Examples of this are dream imagery, visualization, imagination, and vivid memories. So if you consider for a moment a thought is definitely a thing. It's an experiential reality that we have, and thoughts carry their own content and their own energy to them. And it's here for one moment and then it's gone in the next. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end, so to speak. So it's a thing in one layer of reality, and the layer of reality that it resides in, we call it the high subtle state. That's where the thought forms move and percolate through. So the subtle state altogether, what can we say about this realm, this state of consciousness? Well, for one thing, it's coextensive with physical reality. And what I mean by that is the entire time and space of physical universe is interwoven with subtle energy. It's not like physical reality is over here and then there's pockets of subtle energy over there. It's kind of pervasive or woven, like I said, woven together with all time, all space, all objects. But importantly, the subtle energy is not bound to physical structures. So the example that I'll give here is the Sushumna Nadi, or the central channel. Oftentimes it's described as a channel of energy, like a tube that sits just inside the spinal column. Now, there is no anatomical structure of a tube where that energy is flowing through. Rather, we go inside and we feel from the inside to find where that felt sense, where the somatic awareness of that tube is. So the subtle energy flows through this channel, but it is not connected directly to a physical structure. In addition, subtle energy operates beyond linear time and ordinal space. So I've studied Reiki, I practice Reiki, and one of the mind-boggling, amazing things about Reiki is that when I tune into that energy and I send it out, I can send Reiki to myself in the past, I can send Reiki to myself in the future, and experientially it feels like that's what's happening, both in present time when I'm sending it and then in the future when I'm receiving it, if I'm open and aware to receive it. In addition, and I've tested this pretty thoroughly, even though it seems magical, it doesn't match how physical reality works. We can send energy, we can send Reiki across long distances. So right now, I'm on a computer screen, I'm sitting in Kauai, and you are wherever you are, and I can send Reiki through to you, and if you are open, you might feel it come through. And it's not the case that the Reiki energy is coming from here, through my computer screen, through my Wi-Fi, through the fiber optic cable network, and then out your computer screen. It is moving through a different realm, a different state, where it goes directly from my presence, experiential reality, to yours when you receive it. So subtle energy acts a little bit differently. And because it's not dense or solid, it has the qualities of being ephemeral, fickle, whimsical, or volatile. It kind of dances around and it can be challenging to pin it down. Another aspect of the subtle state is the soul resides at this level of consciousness. So the definition that I will use for the soul is the trans-egoic, meaning beyond ego, individual consciousness that continues across lifetimes. So my egoic physical personality self is Matt Sturm. Beyond that, there is an aspect of me, which is individual to me, that is learning and growing through this lifetime, but that me was also me before I was born, before I got this name. And that me will also be me after I die, and it will move into another incarnation, most likely. So that layer of me-ness, that aspect of consciousness, resides in the subtle realm. So moving right along, next layer up is the causal state of consciousness. And again, I'm going to break this into the low causal and the high causal. We'll look at each one separately and then we'll put them together. So the low causal state contains the archetypes. And I'm going to delineate two different types of archetypes. And the language here gets a little bit fuzzy, so just bear with me. There are causal archetypes and evolutionary archetypes. The causal archetypes are the forms, the ideals, and the primal structures of reality that needed to be present at the moment of the Big Bang. So when the Big Bang happened, all matter and energy kind of blew from a singularity into and created the universe. But how that energy operates and how space and time unfolded to hold it, and various constants like the constant of the speed of light, needed to be in place at that moment in order for physical reality to unfold. So that operating system, basic geometric rules, numbers, things like truth and beauty, what Whitehead would call eternal objects, subjective qualities of the colors, things like that. All of that needed to be in place from the beginning for the unfolding. These are the causal archetypes, and they live at the causal level of causal state of consciousness. There's a different type of archetype called evolutionary archetypes, and these include the deities, the myths, and the Jungian archetypes. So for example, the Great Mother, or the Fool, or the Cave. These types of archetypes. We don't have a reason to think that the Fool and the Cave as archetypes existed at the moment of the Big Bang, and that they were waiting eons and eons for humans to come around and discover them. Rather, we would think that as animals began to mate and differentiate into female and male and then nurture their young, that was the beginning of the mother archetype. And generation after generation after generation, we've kind of fleshed out, we've built out the archetype of the Great Mother and these other archetypes. So they evolved along with us and participate in our evolution. All of these archetypes are carried through a structure that I will posit is called a morphic field. Morphic fields are emergent habits of nature. So instead of thinking of the laws as fundamental, absolute rules of how phenomena and nature work, we can think of the universe as moving into emergent habits. So an example here is protons and electrons. The universe cools enough that protons are able to capture that first electron, and it enters into an orbit, and it creates the hydrogen atom. And from that first moment of kind of these two particles figuring out how they stabilize together, that creates a field, a pattern. And the universe remembers this pattern and carries it forward. It becomes the imprint for all future hydrogen atoms. And so it's happened so many times and so many iterations that right now it looks like a law. It's just how it is. But we can think of like animals with instincts that kind of evolve and change over time. What are those instincts? They are these habits that have been repeated over and over and over again and get carried along at a layer of consciousness that moves together with each organism. This brings us to our next point, which is the storehouse consciousness. So in Buddhism, there's a term called the alaya vijnana, and in Jungian psychology, the idea of the collective unconscious. And what this concept is that there is a layer, a substratum, like a depth to the universe, where every single phenomenon leaves an imprint. The universe remembers. And it enters this storehouse of consciousness, and that storehouse informs us in the present moment as we are creatively unfolding through the cosmos. So this aspect of memory that gets passed forward and influences forward is part of the low causal state. At the high end of the spectrum, we have the high causal state. So here we're moving beyond the basic building blocks, the basic rules, even to more primal differentiations. In fact, the first differentiations, or you could even say the last differentiations before unity. So if we look at different spiritual traditions, the basic ways that spirit is different exist here. So from Christianity, we have the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Below them, we would have the archangels and the angels and the many, but these are just the three aspects of the Godhead. And above that, we would just have unity consciousness. That's where we're going next, but here's where there's still some differentiation. Yogic tradition, Satchitananda, being consciousness, bliss. Below this, there's the specifics of what those look like. Above this, there's just unity, but here's the place of being, consciousness, and bliss. These triparts of spirit. Plato and Plotinus and other Greek philosophers, truth, beauty, and goodness, the place where these are distinguished and they're complete, they're full ideals in themselves, that's at this level of consciousness. Basic duality, we take it up just a half step more. Basic duality, however you slice it, so masculine, feminine, Shiva and Shakti, Purusha and Prakriti, so witnessing and phenomenon, dark and light, good and evil, whatever the dualities are, the basics of two-ness. There are just two objects, two aspects of universe. There's one and there's other. One and not one. That is this layer of consciousness. To look at the causal state as a whole, what is the experience when we go there, when I tap into that level? So if I'm experiencing sacred geometry or fractals or space and time itself kind of warping into patterns or white light, this is the causal state itself. I'm getting to the primal building blocks of how the universe is constructed. Pure experiences of love, of bliss, of compassion, of beauty. We hit the ideal and we go to that and we have the deep, full experience of that. That's at this level of consciousness. The beatific vision, so experiencing deities or different evolutionary archetypes like the Great Mother. All these archetypes live at this level, so when I'm tapped into them, when I'm having an experience of that type of God or Godhead or deity, it's occurring at this layer of consciousness. And then in the prior states, we've been in egoic, so personal egoic, and then soul, so individual soul, still individual, still me. At the causal state, we start to move to the collective. So if I'm having an experience of humanity's oversoul, or the Earth's world soul, or if I go have a vision of galactic center and see souls being born into existence, or cosmic consciousness, the consciousness that pervades, the awareness that pervades the entire universe, Christ consciousness, Krishna consciousness, these types of collective experiences all reside in the causal state. And they're transpersonal, they're beyond me. Slide 15, can I understand it as God consciousness? Yes, but there are gradations of God consciousness. So the question is on the prior slide, is that God consciousness in the causal state? If there is me groveling before, like laid back in awe before the grandeur of God, whatever word you want to put there, but there's still like a me before God, yes. And where we're getting to as we move even further on is the union, communion, identity with the deity, with spirit. It's a great question. So now we're continuing to climb the ladder. We're moving up to the next level. We enter the witness state. So to go from basic fundamental building blocks, primal duality, we're now going into unity. The witness state, as I said earlier, is what we experience in deep, dreamless sleep. So take a moment and take yourself back to last night when you were in deep, dreamless sleep. There is a sense that I feel of like, oh yeah, I was there. But there's no phenomenon and there's no me separate from anything else. There's just a baseline of I am awareness. It's kind of underlying or pervading, oh yeah, that experience. So the witness state is awareness without any object. It is witness without anything being witnessed, or pure being, total subjectivity. In Buddhist terms, it's called emptiness, total freedom from any content. This is also known as just I am, like the primal statement of consciousness, I am. It's called the absolute or unity consciousness. So this is where it gets kind of tricky to talk about, because anytime we use language, we're in duality. We're trying to define something other using references for other meanings that we have. Unity means there's no differentiation. We can't differentiate at all. So language begins to fail. This state, the experience of it, or what it is or what it is not, is ungraspable and undefinable. So let's take a little look at what that means. There's an Indian sage named Nagarjuna, a Buddhist philosopher, who argued that these four categories cannot be affirmed as true of, he calls it the void, but it is this state, this realm of consciousness. So we cannot say that it exists. There's nothing I can point to that says this for sure exists, because as soon as I do that, there is a name, an experience, and an experiencer that is dual. We're all blended into one something, void, and I cannot say that it exists. But similarly, I cannot say that it is non-existent. I cannot call it nothing. It gets a little tricky here. So if I can't say that it exists, and I also cannot say that it is non-existent, that leads us to point number 3, which is it cannot be affirmed that it is both existent and non-existent, that it exists in some superimposed, both at once state of being, both existing and non-existing. For one thing, doesn't make any sense, but for the other thing, that would still be calling it something, and we can't call it something. So it's not both existent and non-existent. Well, maybe it's neither. Well, actually, you cannot say that this realm, this state, is neither existent nor non-existent either. In fact, nothing definitive can be said about this state, including this statement itself. Saying this state is undefinable is itself a qualifier, and it doesn't fit. Nothing. So if your brain, if it's starting to, try to wrap this around logically, it's beyond logic. You have to kind of let go into the paradox of what this is. To give us a little bit more from different traditions, here's Meister Eckhart from Christian mysticism. I have sometimes said that there is a power in the soul which alone is free. So now I shall name it in nobler fashion than I ever did before. And yet it disowns the nobler name and mode, for it transcends them. It is free of all names and void of all forms, entirely exempt and free, as God is exempt and free in himself. It is as completely one and simple as God is one and simple, so that no man can in any way glimpse it. So the experience that he is pointing to is beyond any name, beyond any form, void of all forms. It is completely free. It is one and simple, unity. From the Hindu tradition, from more of the yogic perspective, again, just don't try to make sense of these logically, but see where it takes you as these words wash over you. I am the fire that burns the karma of one who is beyond all karma. I am the fire that burns the sorrow of one beyond all sorrow. I am devoid of body. I am the nectar of knowledge, homogeneous existence like the sky. I am the fire that burns the sin of one who is sinless. I am the fire that burns the attributes of one who is without attributes. I am the fire that burns the bondage of one who is without bondage. I am the nectar of knowledge, homogeneous existence, like the sky. My child, I am devoid of non-existence and of existence. My child, I am not devoid of unity and the absence of unity. My child, I am not devoid of mind and absence of mind. I am the nectar of knowledge, homogeneous existence, like the sky. Similarly, in this tradition, this experiential state is beyond non-existence and existence, beyond unity and not unity, beyond mind and not mind. It's just beyond. Now, unity or beyond unity may seem like the highest state that we could attain to. Total oneness, total indescribable, pure experiential, nothing, void, not nothing, not void. But if we look at different spiritual traditions, there is something that is not held, that is missing from the absolute. And some of you may already be onto this. What's missing from the absolute is the relative, is the world of form and phenomenon and all of the differentiation and all of the apparent suffering that goes with it. The absolute is only absolute, does not contain, does not include all of that. So when we move to our final state, non-duality, non-duality is the union of the pure witness state with the totality of all phenomenon. It's both. It's everything. That is truly everything. This goes by various names, which includes enlightenment, realization, moksha, Sanskrit word which means liberation, suchness, and thusness. One way to try to conceptualize non-duality, like what we're pointing to here, it is objects and awareness of objects experienced as a seamless whole. So right now we're in duality. There's me over here and I'm seeing you over there. But if instead there is a seamless whole between experiencer and experience, that is non-duality, not two, non-dual. Another way to conceptualize this is you can imagine looking through the eyes of all beings across all times. So the consciousness that looks out and perceives all phenomenon across all times, across the entire universe, meeting and perceiving all phenomenon, and at the same time as that we're looking out through all the eyes, we are ourselves being all of the entities that are being perceived. And that is the experience of enlightenment. There is no inside or outside, it's all whole, seamless whole. Non-duality is the totality of existence exactly as it is. And this is what we mean by suchness or thusness. Again, I have some quotes here to share from different spiritual traditions, just to get some other flavor on how we approach this. So Evelyn Underhill is a Christian mystic. She says, hence, there are really two distinct acts of divine union, two distinct kinds of illumination involved in the mystic way. The dual character of the spiritual consciousness brings a dual responsibility in its train. So the first aspect is union with life, with the world of becoming, and parallel with it the illumination by which the mystic gazes upon a more veritable world. That's the relative. Second, there is the union with being, with the one, and that final, ineffable illumination of pure love which is called knowledge of God. Lex Hixon, realized being who studied a number of different spiritual traditions, but in this quote in particular, he's commenting on the Heart Sutra of Buddhism. All material forms and all conscious states are to be known as absolutely selfless, without separate identity, luminously pure. The processes of personal awareness do not need to be purified. They are ontologically transparent or perfectly pure by their very nature. All the apparently complex forms of functional interdependence remain utterly simple, indivisible, pristine, open, and free. Universal transparency is what manifests as both form and consciousness. Material forms are empty of the slightest substantial self-existence, and luminous emptiness of self-existence is precisely what is manifest as material forms. In the same way, conscious states are empty of the slightest independent self-existence, and luminous emptiness of self-existence is precisely what is manifest as conscious states. And again, if you try to grasp this with your conceptual mind, it's going to be challenging. Finally, quote from Adyashanti, who's a contemporary mystic and teacher. He says, "In fact, there is no such thing as a path to enlightenment, simply because enlightenment is ever present in all places and at all times. What you can do is to remove any and all illusions, especially the ones you value most and find the most security in, that cloud your perception of reality. Let go of clinging to your illusions and resisting what is, and reality will suddenly come into view." And what this points to, why I included this quote, is because enlightenment is not out there. It's not a destination. It's not something that we have to get to or find. Right, yes. Reality or enlightenment or non-duality is the nature of what we are. And we perceive ourselves to be different. We have illusions, and we believe in those illusions, and we're attached to those illusions. And that's why we're in this experience. And we justify each other's illusions. We say, oh yeah, that illusion that you believe in, yeah, that's real. I'm going to agree with that. But beyond that is our fundamental nature, which is the fundamental nature of reality, which is that it is not different. It's non-dual. It's free. Okay, so let's take a breath together. These are our 5 states of consciousness: gross, subtle, causal, pure witness, and non-dual. So I'd like to close this talk with a little share about why expanded states matter. So recall, states are transitory experiences. I can access a state of consciousness through spiritual practices, through sacred ceremony, or sometimes they even happen spontaneously. Regardless, we go to an expanded state, and then eventually we return to our baseline. We come back, we land back down. So expanded states, when they are integrated well, can be helpful for a number of reasons. First is they show us what is possible on our path of evolution. The analogy here is that imagine I'm on my spiritual path and I'm navigating through a forest of dense trees. I'm kind of picking my way through. I have a state experience, an expanded experience that takes me up to the mountaintop. From the mountaintop, I'm able to survey. I look down and I go, oh, there's the path I'm walking, and here's where that path leads next. And eventually I come back down from the mountaintop and I'm back on the path in the trees, but now I can see that's the direction. In addition, expanded states connect us with meaning, purpose, truth, compassion, etc. These qualities, these ideals. And when I go fully in and I'm immersed in the experience of truth or beauty, I'm moved and I bring that back into my daily life. And the purpose that I find, or the truth that I find from that state begins to inform who I am and how I interact with my world now. Chogyam Trungpa calls this basic sanity. So we have the expanded experience, we come back, and then we've gotten outside of our narrow-minded neuroses, the neuroses of the ego. And we start to align to the basic sanity of reality. And this is, by the way, something that researchers have now measured. People go, they have a primary spiritual experience or a primary religious experience, and they come back, and over time, they live lives that are happier and more fulfilling. And other people who are close to them in their lives report the same, that these people are changed. So they're valuable, again, when we can integrate them in a good way into our lives. On a collective level, mystical experiences form the core of spiritual traditions and organized religion. Every religion began with some human having some mystical experience and translating that for other humans to tap into. When a spiritual tradition loses touch with the mystical core, it becomes overrun by power structures and dogma and the ways that we've seen religion oppress humans over many different cultures and many different ages. But when the mystical core remains intact, when practitioners can continue to go and have those experiences, it keeps those traditions alive and healthy. There's a vitality that gets imbued. So expanded states of consciousness are important for the traditions that carry forth the wisdom across generations. Final point, repeated exposure to an expanded state helps us learn how to make that state into our new baseline. And this is kind of the whole point of doing meditation practice regularly again and again, is the expanded state opens. I go from waking consciousness, I have the expanded experience, I come back. I go, I have it, I come back. I have it, I stay a little longer, I come back. And slowly, slowly over time, I learn how to bridge that, how to integrate it and weave it into a new, more expanded state of consciousness. And that one-time transitory state starts to become a stable lived experience. That's the whole idea of spiritual practices. So these are why we care about expanded states of consciousness. This is why they matter. So we have a question here about, or a comment rather, around how this is moving. And what I would say is that what we're describing here is the truth of who we are and what we're here to do in this human life. Not everybody has to or will decide to go explore these realms, pick up any kind of spiritual practice, but there is a knowingness, there's a longing that we have inside of us to make this journey. And so as we're describing it here, it touches that longing, touches that sense of like, this is what I'm here to do. Meaning, purpose, truth. Yeah. So that's our map. And the map is all well and good. The map is really helpful to see the terrain. Oh, question. Do I have any book recommendations? Yes. If you And that's one of the reasons why I included quotes from all these different thinkers and authors. Pick up any one of them, whichever one, whoever is calling to you, and they're going to give you their version of this. In terms of looking at states of consciousness, the second quote that I gave towards the beginning, when we were still in our technical difficulty phase, Ken Wilber, this guy has done more than anybody else in contemporary culture to map out what these are. So he has written many, many books. They are dense but fabulous, and he brings his own personal flair into them. But he has really correlated everything and then simplified it into his system. So that is a lot of what I'm drawing on here. Great question.